A couple of months ago, Baldur's Gate 3 was released to a commercial and critical fanfare that seemed to surprise a lot of people.
It seemed like the industry had underestimated the popularity of CRPGs, or at the very least, a desire for deep and meaningful single-player experiences. A lot of people had opinions about this. Destin Lagari at IGN claimed that Baldur's Gate 3 was causing panic in game dev circles and showed that many developers just had low standards, while Jason Schreier said that the secret to Larian's success was that they were privately owned.
And while those arguments definitely struck a chord with some people, I find that they're two-dimensional answers to a three-dimensional question.
If there's one thing I've learned from over a decade of talking to people who make successful games about why they're successful, is that the answers are usually not so simple. So today on By Design, I'm going to pick apart the development and reception of Baldur's Gate 3 and try to find some answers as to what made this game successful. To do this, I'm going to take a look at the history of Larian Studios, interview their director of publishing about their internal strategy, talk to CohhCarnage about the changing face of CRPG fandom, and try not to get too focused on the bear sex. But the bear sex was definitely part of it. The bear sex is causing panic in game dev circles.
We have a lot to cover here, but we're going to start with three topics first. Number one, the history of Larian Studios. Number two, a health check on the CRPG genre. And number three, how Baldur's Gate 3 was marketed. Cool. Let's jump in.
Okay, let's get the most obvious point out of the way. Baldur's Gate 3 is a fantastically well-made video game. It's wonderfully written, it looks gorgeous, it has great voice acting, interesting locations, it has the best dice rolling animation on the planet, and enough emergent gameplay to cause Warren Spector to piss his pants with joy. Almost nothing else about Baldur's Gate 3's success is worth talking about without first acknowledging this. It may seem obvious, but the biggest key to any game's success is its design, and Baldur's Gate 3 is a fantastically well-designed game.
But there is still a question here. How was it well designed? No video game is made in a vacuum, so first let's establish the conditions that Baldur's Gate 3 was made under,
and analyze how it appeals to both existing fans of CRPGs and seemingly this unexpectedly wider audience. I've spent the best part of a decade visiting game studios around the world, and in my opinion, if there's one element that contributes to the long-term success of any development team, an environment where people improve their skills and each new game is greater than the last, it's institutional knowledge. When game studios invest in their team's long-term health, when they keep their smartest people, it has a multiplying effect on the rest of the studio. Like a paladin or a priest doing a spell or, some D&D shit. I don't know, cantrips.
It allows decisions to be made faster, problems to be avoided earlier, and hopefully creates the conditions where ability is the most valuable asset.
Smart teams keep getting smarter, and you can see that in a lot of your favorite games. Think id Software from Wolfenstein to Quake, Guerrilla from Killzone to Horizon, CD Projekt from Witcher 1 to Witcher 3, Supergiant from Bastion to Hades. Larian is a studio with RPG pumping through their veins. They've been committed to this genre since the late 90s, slowly developing these skills while occasionally staving off bankruptcy. They've also learned some important and costly lessons. Both Divine Divinity and Divinity 2 were forced to market by their publishers long before the games were finished, so they kickstarted and self-published Divinity Original Sin. This game was their moonshot, and it worked out. It sold 2.5 million units and was well received by the CRPG world. We gave it the PC Game of the Year at GameSpot. Here's me in 2014 talking to reviews editor Kevin Van Ord about how great the game is. Kevin would end up moving to Ghent to work as a writer on Divinity Original Sin 2, and he was needed. One of the criticisms of the first game was its writing, understandable as the team spoke English as a second language. So to help improve that aspect of the sequel, aside from hiring Kevin, they also opened up a new studio in Dublin, Ireland to focus on writing. To combat the relatively high cost of hiring game devs in Belgium, they bought and expanded upon a studio they'd worked with in St. Petersburg. And to combat the crunch they'd felt on Original Sin 1, they opened up a studio in Canada so that work on the game could go through the night. They made key hires in areas they needed more knowledge in, and the studio now employs around 400 people in locations such as Ghent, Dublin, Quebec, Kuala Lumpur, Guildford, and Barcelona. So while Baldur's Gate has been worked on for a few years, it's the beneficiary of over a decade of toil and craft, of business expansion and learning, of working in a particular genre and getting to understand their audience. When Larian started development on Baldur's Gate 3, they were already years further down the path than most studios are now. It would be an enormous challenge for a new studio or existing studio without CRPG experience to try and make a game like Baldur's Gate 3 from scratch today.
Okay, next up is the genre, and for Baldur's Gate 3 there are actually two genres we need to talk about.
The first is computer role-playing games, or CRPGs. Think classic games like Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, or in more modern times, Disco Elysium. And the second is the more general pop culture genre of tabletop role-playing games. Let's get that one out of the way first. Tabletop role-playing games like D&D have gone through a popular renaissance over the past decade. I remember back when Critical Role were blowing up on Twitch around 2015. Since then, it seems like most content creators have given D&D a go. So while D&D is not quite Star Wars levels of popularity these days, it's much more popular than ever, or at the very least, many of these social barriers that held it back so long have loosened. The popularity of CRPGs, on the other hand, is a lot more difficult to quantify. The original two Baldur's Gates are celebrated as some of the best CRPGs of all time, alongside their cousins Icewind Dale and Planescape Torment, but it's also fair to say that they've drifted somewhat from memory. When Disco Elysium came out in 2019, it made a lot of people, myself included, stand up and take notice of this genre again. It's another fantastically well-designed game that won countless awards, sold bucket loads, and inspired a generation of developers to give this style of game design a swing. But it's not like these games didn't exist before Disco. Games like Pillars of Eternity and Pathfinder were keeping the fire lit for years, albeit to a seemingly smaller audience.
It seems like a second wave of modern CRPGs is about to break, but truth be told, this genre is a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
So to get a better example of the state of the market, the expectations of fans, and the success of Baldur's Gate 3, I jumped on a call with a streamer who's been doing long play streams of CRPGs for years, even when the audience wasn't really there. And I guess it also helps that he was actually in Baldur's Gate 3.
Roar! Are you scared? Did you wet your pants? Did you?
One of the tropes with CRPGs is that they're super narrative heavy. They're really, really deep. You have to be into reading. And let's be blunt, they were kind of associated with being a nerd. You had to be a big art because they had hugely deep mechanics. You had to generally take a class at a local community college to know how to play them properly and build your characters right. Then you had, millions of words of reading on top of them. The last kind of caveat for that is they're generally long. They're these long, giant experiences. So, people just, the more of those you add up, the less you have in terms of an audience that even wants to / can play the product. The big thing with Baldur's Gate 3 is it's one of the first times we've seen a level of AAA quality resources go into a genre that frankly normally never makes enough money to see that. When every single character is professionally voice acted, professionally mocapped, when every single aspect of the game, especially in the first 2 acts on release, are rock solid with all avenues explored countless times to make sure that you can do everything you want to, when every piece of that puzzle falls into place, that creates a veneer that we're not used to seeing here. I'll never forget during one of the panels from Hell, when they mention that kind of almost casually, which is so wild, but they said, based on your feedback in early access, we've decided to completely change the UI of our game and how it's presented to the player. They had their vision of what they thought was best in their game. And then thanks to their early access, most importantly, thanks to their approach of what early access is, we saw them just keep adding user feedback. And then eventually it completely transformed. And you look at what we got from release and compare it to what we got on the day 1 of early access. And that shows you exactly what Larian did with their early access. They utilized it. It was a tool to make their game better.
Baldur's Gate 3 was in early access for almost 3 years, and according to CohhCarnage and my own poking around online, there seemed to be a fairly consistent feedback loop between the players and the design team. And by having the game in early access for 3 years, by collecting heuristics, watching streams, and listening in on Reddit threads, it gave the studio the type of access to feedback that RPG developers don't often get. And of course, this wasn't their first rodeo. Divinity Original Sin 2 had an early access window also.
But how about the audience? has been live streaming to CRPG fans for a couple of years now, so I wanted to know when this transition happened. When did Baldur's Gate 3 stop being just popular with hardcore CRPG fans and break out into this wider mainstream audience?
I feel like this has to be mentioned. Whoever at Larian decided that really shining a spotlight on the bear scene, whoever decided that should happen should get a marketing award. And let me tell you why. Of course, we can laugh about it. It's hilarious. But I'll never forget the next day when I saw publications and stories coming out of companies that didn't even play games. I mean, these were companies that just followed internet culture and things. They never wrote about games. And all of a sudden, Baldur's Gate 3 is front and center. And then, sure, it gets through the fact that the bear love, if you want to, but then you see at the bottom of these articles, this is one of the first times an RPG will let you do whatever you want and go wherever you want. And all of a sudden we see all these organic tendrils going out. And then all of a sudden you see all these people that are talking about it that never would have normally. The amount of people in my chat room that had said, I don't normally like CRPGs, but I love Baldur's Gate 3. The beautiful thing about Baldur's Gate 3 is even with its incredible veneer, beautiful presentation, amazing voice acting, amazing mocapping, an incredible cast of characters, at its heart, it's still a deep, rich, story-based, mechanically deep RPG game. And a lot of times these games are seen as pretty risky. As somebody who invests in games myself, especially more recently, these are games that take a long time to make. They take a lot of effort. And to put it bluntly, a lot of times they don't have that payoff. So my big hope with Baldur's Gate 3, and I've already seen it happening, is that it brings in new players that may have not normally been exposed to just how special these games can be. I have already talked to thousands of people at this point that have asked me, hey, I've played Baldur's Gate 3. I loved it. What do I play next? What else is there? And I'm really hoping that this new exposure to the CRPG genre as a whole will propel the entire thing forward. We have another fantastic company, Owlcat, that has Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader coming out at the end of this month, which is the first CRPG we've ever seen in the Warhammer 40k universe. Just last week, Josh Sawyer of Obsidian was jokingly saying that if Phil gave him $120 million, he'd make Pillars of Eternity 3. So of course I was like, do it!
Okay, quick sidebar. We're going to talk about the marketing in just a second, but first, I want to explore something that Coach just mentioned there.
He said that Baldur's Gate 3 appealed to folks who had never really played CRPGs, and I'm wondering if a lot of these people are starved Bioware fans. From 2007 to 2013, we had a massive surge in popularity for role-playing games. The breakthrough success stories of World of Warcraft and Oblivion had a big part in this. And even Call of Duty was adding progression to their shooters from 2007. Bioware, the creators of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, were the tip of that spear, with Mass Effect and Dragon Age achieving mainstream success for games that were focused on talking, diplomacy, and interspecies butt-rubbing. But since the ending of Mass Effect 3, Bioware have dramatically lost step with their fans, creating a handful of games that fall well short of expectations, and multiplayer shooter Anthem which really soured their relationship with the fanbase. Is the success of Baldur's Gate 3 somewhat due to a Bioware-shaped hole in the market? Have fans of those games been encouraged to try something outside of their comfort zone out of sheer depression?
I've no data to back any of this up, but it just kind of feels right. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.
So, we've established that Baldur's Gate 3 is a well-made game and that it appropriately met the market and exceeded expectations of both tried and true CRPG fans and a more general RPG audience. But we still haven't talked about how. To answer some of these more nuanced questions, I got in contact with Larian's Director of Publishing, Michael Douse. I couldn't interview Michael remotely, but he very kindly responded to an email I sent the night before he was going on a well-earned vacation. Michael works out of Larian's Dublin office, but he himself is English.
So, to get a character-appropriate voice for his email, I stuck 20 of my best English friends' names on a list and rolled for it.
First, I asked Michael,
what were the commercial expectations going into launch?
The sales for BG3 are within my expected projections, but it's very important to understand that these projections are foundationally defined by support from our core audience. and what we learn about who they are. There's no retail release. We didn't sim ship across platforms. A number of commercially questionable decisions were made confidentially thanks, in no small part, to what we understand about our core community as a sort of microcosm of a much broader community. BG3 appeals to people who thought they'd like it and people who thought they'd never like it. Why that is probably the subject for a talk sometime. Baldur's Gate 3 is a game for people who like RPGs.
So why do you think it sold so well? Is there a wider market for CRPGs than we thought? Has the popularity of D&D got anything to do with it?
We never use the term CRPG in our campaigns for a reason. It plays very well on a PlayStation 5. DOS 2 plays extremely well on an iPad Pro. These are no longer computer RPGs. If you consider CRPG to mean classic RPG, I promise you that BG3 is not a classic RPG, but a modern RPG. It has a lot of depth, but it's doing things most RPGs aren't able to do. The latter is a big reason for its perceived success. Every time we release a CRPG, we know that the CRPG audience grows. The only reason, at least on the industry side, that people think that the audience is small is because there isn't a big enough pool of data to pull from. How well should BG3 do? Well, what other CRPG with AAA production values are you going to look at to project from? It's a blessing and a curse. Don't get me wrong, it's very much 99.99% a blessing, but academically, the lack of substantiation, even internally, can create complex problems that require complex solutions. Colourful mathematics.
Was there a single point in the marketing where you noticed Baldur's Gate 3 gaining momentum?
As with any game, the distance between announcement and release generally defines the momentum. You probably want me to say the bear, but if you've played BG3, you probably know that there are many, many moments in the game that make you go, what the fuck? It could have been any one of those. This one in particular was chosen because it worked in the presentation flow of the press preview event, which happened to be at the right moment for marketing to get a little broader. The truth is, it's the core audience who help present and propel the game to the broader audience. They are the custodians of our content, to a degree. We do our thing as well, but the world decided together that it was time to start looking at what BG3 is in its final form. Probably helps that we did a press preview event, but this is the boring part of the answer. I've got a Mind Flayer in my run, while my entire party stared at me in disgust. I don't know if that would have got us banned on TikTok, but it would have had the same effect. BG3 gained momentum, in truth, when all of its systems came into play, and we were able to show the game in its final form. If we'd isolated the bear without the rest of what was shown, which was a lot, it would have just been a week-long meme at best.
And how important do you think the time in early access was for marketing the game?
Blessing and a curse. Not a lot of what we did was conventional commercial wisdom. We didn't sim ship, we announced as part of Stadia, we're a narrative game in early access. We didn't release much story content other than Grimforge. We were late. There was a war which made us late again. In spite of all of that, what early access does do is it lets you hone in on the people that stick around. We really got to know our community, and through that we got a microcosm of a broader audience. We got to understand our language with this game and to understand what resonates. In spite of all the downsides, early access helped us to understand that. Look, this is going to be a no bullshit operation. We talk to them, they talk to us, we all work it out together. I wouldn't have had it any other way.
The name of this show is By Design, and it's meant to be somewhat self-aware. Over the years, from talking to developers, I've learned that all decisions, be it design decisions, gameplay decisions, product or marketing decisions, you can make the most well-informed choice you want, but whether or not that decision was a good idea or not is kind of decided by the player.
So no success or failure is really by design. It's the culmination of dozens of informed decisions that push and nudge a game in lots of different directions. But I believe there are some absolutes we can take away from the success of Baldur's Gate 3. First, it's really well made, crafted by a team of developers who were dedicated to this genre for years when it was out of fashion. Secondly, the market came to meet them, either because of the general popularity of tabletop role-playing, because of games like Disco Elysium that exposed new players to this style of game, or due to modern conveniences like voice acting that helped to soften the market. And thirdly, the game was smart in its publishing and marketing strategy. It never felt like a game you needed to have played the original two Baldur's Gates to understand, or even to have experience in the genre to enjoy. It was approachable, it was personal, and the marketing was honest. and a smartly executed early access strategy ensured that Baldur's Gate 3 launched in as finished a state as possible.
So what can other developers learn from the success of Baldur's Gate 3? Simply have as much money as it takes to make the best possible version of the game you want?
Well, the thing about games development is that creative decisions that teams are allowed to make, to put the game into early access for 3 years, to make sure every character is voiced, to ensure every player choice is mirrored by the game in some way, all of these decisions that seemingly raise the standards of the game to a level that gamers expect, are ultimately informed by the budget, especially at a AAA level. And this is where things get a little bit more complex. According to Jason Schreier in Wikipedia, Larian is a private company. But after some digging around on Irish business registries and paying a few quid to get access to old documents, I found that Larian Group Holdings Limited, based in Dublin, is in fact 30% owned by Tencent. Now, I can't get much more detailed on their financials than that, but while the Divinity Original Sin game sold well, I suspect much more capital would be required to keep a 400-person studio operating for years. It makes sense that the company would leverage their position to bring in extra capital to help fund all this growth.
Now don't get me wrong, this isn't like a smoking gun, this is just the reality of what it takes to make games of this quality in 2023, and it has a lot to do with how games are sold.
The truth is, you cannot reduce the business operation of a company down to whether or not they are publicly traded or privately owned. Privately owned companies can have debtors, and publicly traded companies can have majority ownership. For example, the similar European success story of CD Projekt. When they became public through a share takeover of a Polish tech firm, it allowed them to access new forms of capital to invest in their studio. In the 2008 words of Adam Kaczynski, the immediate financing we obtained through the deal will allow us to pursue our operational goals in troubled times. The troubled times he's talking about were the financial crash of 2008, and the operational goals was funding their breakthrough hit, The Witcher 3. Good financial planning can lead to good games, but bad financial planning rarely does. As the worlds of big tech and games have converged over the past few years, we've seen much more investment from private equity or venture capital firms into the world of gaming. I mean, I'm literally being paid by a venture capital firm to produce this series. And part of the reason for this is that successful games can come from both small teams and large teams, but both of these are usually in need of some funding. Games, for the most part, don't make any money until they're finished and released. This creates a massive financial burden on the part of the creator to fund the entire production of the product until they can make any money back.
And given the time it takes to make AAA games in this modern era, something that is exponentially longer than what they had to deal with back in the day, just the level of capital investment required is simply out of reach for most.
Making games at this scale and level of quality requires smart business planning. And while Baldur's Gate 3 was likely not financed from the CEO's savings account, it is the CEO's vision that made this game possible. Sven and the many others who have been part of Larian's journey throughout the many layers of CRPG hell they've scrambled through have done what they've done with a clear artistic goal in mind: to make the AAA CRPG of their dreams. Along that path, they've learned valuable lessons in business about the type of creative and financial independence they value. They learned how to expand their business in ways that benefited the development of the game, reducing crunch and expanding the knowledge base of the team. And more importantly, they learned how to make the type of complex, high-quality game that we get to enjoy in Baldur's Gate 3. Making games is incredibly difficult. Some publishers love to nickel and dime gamers, absolutely. Are some developers less interested in innovation than others? Of course. But we shouldn't reduce the success of games like Baldur's Gate 3 down to these personal values or platitudes, especially when the reality is a much greater story over decades.
It's the byproduct of a lot of toil and craft, a studio with a laser-sharp focus working within their core competency, using early access to refine that experience and then marketing that game to a much wider audience, an audience of gamers who were starving for an RPG experience with more meat on its bones. And hey, sure, you could also f the bear.